This is what happened when Freddie Mercury's only sister, Kashmira Bulsara, finally spoke out against the massive auction of her brother's most private possessions. For several decades, the Bulsara family stayed out of the spotlight while Freddie became a global star, but they finally broke that silence in 2023.
When he got Garden Lodge, it was beautiful. And he made the garden into a Japanese garden because he loved going to Japan. I always enjoyed visiting him because he'd got a chef, he'd got a chauffeur.
The exhibit today features an extraordinary collection of art antiques and personal possessions that Freddie Mercury accumulated throughout his life.
When the doors of Garden Lodge were opened to the highest bidders, the public saw a collection of treasures. But Kashmira saw the final dismantling of her brother's private sanctuary. This event was much more than a simple sale of celebrity items because it turned a rock legend's intimate world into a global marketplace. Sotheby's in London hosted a series of 6 auctions in September of 2023 called A World of His Own, which put the small details of Freddie's daily life on display for the entire world. Mary Austin was his primary heir and the person he once called the love of his life, and she was the one who decided to sell roughly 1,400 items from his home. The final total reached £40,624, which works out to over $50 million.
This is Freddie's mustache comb, which I believe has been bid up to 20k at the moment.
This amount was far higher than the initial estimate of £11.3 million, and it proved that the world is still fascinated by Freddie 3 decades after his death. One of the most famous pieces sold was Freddie's Yamaha baby grand piano, and the final price tag for the instrument reached £1.74 million. He wrote many of his greatest hits on those keys, and many people argued that a piece of history like that belonged in a museum rather than a private collection. The handwritten lyrics for Bohemian Rhapsody sold for £1.37 million to an anonymous buyer, which means those pages might never be seen by the public again. Another emotional moment occurred when the green garden door of his home was taken off its hinges and sold for over £400,000.
This is the famous green door that was on Garden Lodge. You guys, my friend Stone's name is on here somewhere. Look at that.
That door was covered in messages from fans who had visited the house over the years, and seeing it sold felt like the literal end of the sanctuary Freddie built in Kensington. Even though the auction was a massive financial success, it caused a great deal of pain for Freddie's sister. Kashmira was 73 years old when she sat down for an emotional interview with the BBC to explain why the event caused her so much distress. She called the sale of her brother's life both sad and heartbreaking. Speaking as a sibling who knew the man long before the rest of the world did, Kashmira admitted that she could not bring herself to attend the auction or bid on the items because she felt they already belonged to the history of her family. Staying away was not about a lack of interest, but rather the emotional difficulty of watching her brother's private world be sold off piece by piece.
Look at Freddie's Pablo Picasso up for auction, folks. Jacqueline Chapeau Noir.
Her goal was not to gain money, but to protect a legacy that she felt was being scattered across the globe. She publicly asked for the collection to be kept together as a museum, where fans could learn about Freddie's true roots in a respectful environment. Kashmira wanted these items to honor his complex identity, including his early life in Zanzibar and his Parsi heritage. She saw these things as sacred relics of an immigrant success story that started way before the stadium tours and fame. Her statement made it clear that there is still a quiet tension between Freddie's biological family and the legal heirs he named in his will.
He did say that he has got an incurable blood disease. And I just said to him, "It's not AIDS, is it?" And he completely denied it. But I knew that it was AIDS.
Seeing Kashmira Bulsara so upset reminds everyone that the contents of Garden Lodge were never just financial assets to the people who shared Freddie's DNA. For his sister, that collection was the physical evidence of the Bulsara family history and the long journey they made from Zanzibar to their new life in England. Selling those pieces off one by one shattered that family story, which left his relatives to grieve the loss of their only remaining physical link to him. It was a rare and vulnerable public moment for Kashmira, who has spent decades shielding her brother's memory from the constant prying of the international media. She chose to speak out at 73 years old to make sure people understood that the true cost of the auction could not be measured in currency alone.
It was so sad. I felt that it was a waste of a lovely, talented life.
The massive gap between the financial triumph at Sotheby's and the personal sorrow of the Bulsara family highlights the complicated reality of a global celebrity legacy. Mary Austin definitely had the legal authority to sell the property however she wanted, but Kashmira felt a deep moral responsibility to keep it all together as one piece. These kinds of disagreements happen often with the estates of legendary artists because the rights of legal heirs frequently collide with a family's wish to preserve a private shrine. For Kashmira, seeing those items sold felt like a final and painful goodbye to the world her brother built, a world she believed should have been protected for the future.
I think so, because I just want to keep his memory as long as I can.
Well, listen, it was great. I met you both last week. Great to have you inside.
Her voice is a reminder that some things are far too precious to be sold, even when the final price tag reaches into the tens of millions. Kashmira Bulsara occupies a very specific place in the financial structure of the massive legacy her brother left behind after he passed away in 1991. When Freddie Mercury died, his will ensured that the future earnings from his music would be split among the people who were closest to him during his life. Kashmira originally received a 25% share of the estate, which gave her both financial independence and a permanent link to the professional success of her brother. After her parents Jer and Bomi passed away, her ownership stake grew to 50% and made her one of the most influential beneficiaries of the entire Queen brand. This income remains incredibly high because the Queen catalog is still dominating radio and streaming services around the world every single day. The release of the film Bohemian Rhapsody in 2018 acted as a huge financial engine for the family because that movie earned more than. With all that financial influence, Kashmira hit a very hard legal wall during the Sotheby's auction that took place in 2023. She might own a massive portion of the royalties and the intellectual property tied to Freddie Mercury, but she had zero legal power to stop the sale of physical items. Freddie's will was very specific and named Mary Austin as the only owner of the house and every single object that was kept inside those walls. That specific legal arrangement meant that Mary alone could decide what happened to the furniture, the famous stage costumes, and the original handwritten lyrics. Kashmira could not step in and stop the auction even with her multi-million-pound income because the laws of inheritance are completely absolute. The physical artifacts belonged to the person Freddie chose as his main heir, which left his biological family with plenty of wealth but no control over the items he used every day. Kashmira decided against a public legal battle that likely would have failed. She chose instead to focus her energy on the private archives belonging to the Bulsara family, which were never part of the Garden Lodge estate. These items include private letters, family photographs, and cultural artifacts from the years they spent in Zanzibar and India. While many public items are now scattered among anonymous collectors, the family makes sure the personal history of Farrokh Bulsara stays under their protection. By focusing on these private memories, Kashmira maintained her dignity and a necessary emotional distance, while she watched her brother's belongings go to the highest bidders.
A bit of both, really, but mostly I remember is that he was very generous and kind, and he always used to spoil me, so that was nice.
She chose to hold on to the heritage and memories that money could never buy. The tension surrounding the Sotheby's auction involved much more than money because it represented two completely different ideas of how a legacy should be handled. Mary Austin stood by her decision throughout the entire process. She described the sale as a healthy and necessary step toward closing a very special chapter of her life after living inside Garden Lodge for more than 30 years. Her view was based on practical necessity and a genuine desire to see these objects find new owners who would appreciate them in a different context. Austin wanted the sale to have a positive social impact, so she committed a large portion of the money to the Mercury Phoenix Trust and the Elton John AIDS Foundation. This donation was a deliberate way to honor the generous spirit Freddie was known for while continuing the fight against the disease that took his life. From the perspective of the Bulsara family, these items represented something far more sacred than simple celebrity memorabilia. They saw his possessions as relics of a Parsi immigrant success story that started in a small corner of the world and ended on the biggest stages imaginable. To Kashmira, these were not just things to be sold. These objects were the physical evidence of the incredible and unlikely journey her brother took through his life. The thought of these objects being sold individually felt like the tragic loss of a shrine that could have educated future generations.
When he got Garden Lodge, it was beautiful. And he made the garden into a Japanese garden because he loved going to Japan. I always enjoyed visiting him because he'd got a chef, he'd got a chauffeur.
While many people saw the sale as a practical way for Mary Austin to move forward, Kashmira viewed it as the moment her brother's life was turned into a product. This was the moment when Freddie Mercury fully changed from a private man with a home full of memories into a global commodity with a market value. This deep disagreement shows the painful path family members often have to walk after a superstar as big as Freddie passes away. Some people viewed the decision to empty out the interior of Garden Lodge as a practical move for a woman who wanted to simplify her life. For those who shared his blood and heritage, the sale felt like a betrayal. It was a betrayal of the history that shaped him into a unique artist. The auction marked the end of an era when his personal world was kept safe behind the high brick walls of his home in Kensington. Those walls have now been effectively breached. The items that once occupied his most private spaces are scattered across the entire globe. This shift forced the Bulsara family to find new ways to honor his memory by focusing on his talent and the personal stories that no auction house could ever sell. The heavy atmosphere surrounding the Sotheby's sale reached far beyond the Bulsara family, touching the men who spent 20 years performing alongside Freddie.
Having now a Royal Mint Freddie coin is just wonderful and very fitting.
Brian May spent a lifetime as one of the singer's closest friends, and he found himself mourning in unison with Kashmira as the London event began. He chose to speak out quite candidly to his followers, admitting that watching his friend's life play out on social media was simply too painful. His message struck a chord with many fans who felt a similar discomfort while watching intimate personal items go to the highest bidder. This rare moment of public vulnerability from a surviving Queen member gave a great deal of weight to the points Kashmira had been making. Before we continue into how the band handled this commercialization of Freddie's history, do you agree with Brian May that these personal items were simply too private to be sold? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you are enjoying the story so far, hitting like and subscribing really helps us keep making content like this.
Seemed to happen easily to us, and then we seem to gain success very readily. And so they thought, oh.
Now, let's carry on. For the remaining band members, this auction represented a level of commercialization they had spent years trying to avoid while managing the group's history. They have always been sharp in their business dealings, but they generally maintained a respectful distance from the details of Freddie's home life. Brian May's reaction made it obvious that he didn't see these things as collectible assets or investments. He viewed them as the private possessions of a man who was no longer around to keep them safe from the public eye. By calling the entire spectacle too sad to watch, he stood firmly with the family and highlighted the gap between a celebration and a tragedy. While the auction house spent its time calculating the market value of stage outfits and grand pianos, Kashmira remained focused on a different kind of recovery. She wanted to preserve her brother's human identity and ensure that the man born as Farooq Bulsara wasn't lost beneath the towering image of a rock star. This goal has become the main focus of her life lately, especially since the physical pieces of his fame are now scattered across the world.
We got to see the Yamaha grand piano now, where he wrote most of the lyrics for Bohemian Rhapsody on it. And here she is, you guys. Wow. And it's actually in the piano stool.
Even though the famous Yamaha piano and his original handwritten lyrics are in private hands, Kashmira still holds onto the family's private memories. These Parsi traditions and personal stories are things no auction house could ever accurately appraise, and they remain under her careful protection. Kashmira is now the primary voice keeping the Zanzibar refugee portion of the story alive, which was a narrative largely missing from the Sotheby's catalogs. This era of his life involved the family being displaced and their subsequent struggle to build a new life in London as immigrants. She believes this is where the real foundation of his character was built, and she works to ensure the world remembers that specific resilience. She considers herself the protector of his true heritage, which feels more important now that his physical belongings have been removed from their original home. Her dedication ensures that the history of the Bulsara family stays at the center of the narrative, regardless of who bought his old furniture. The choice to stay away from the auction and refuse to bid on anything was perhaps the strongest statement she could have made against the sale. It certainly wasn't a matter of money, as her own share of the band's estate has made her a very wealthy woman over the years. Instead, it was a very deliberate decision to reject the idea that her brother's legacy could be purchased by a stranger. By keeping her distance, she sent a clear message that the most important parts of his existence were never meant for a marketplace.
This is Freddie's mustache comb, which I believe has been bid up to 20k at the moment.
This brings us to the core reality of this entire struggle, which was never really about a simple exchange of money. It was a fight for the soul of a legacy and a choice between moving on and protecting something sacred. Her final stance was a way of saying that the man she knew was not for sale and that he never would be. The auction reached a total of more than £40 million. But Kashmira Bulsara sees that number as a historical loss that no amount of money could fix. She felt the real worth of those belongings came from them being together inside Garden Lodge, where they acted as a complete map of her brother's incredible life. Once those items were scattered to anonymous buyers all over the world, that map was essentially ripped into 1,000 different pieces. Every person who bought something now holds a tiny fragment of Freddie's world, yet the original context that gave those pieces meaning has disappeared for good.
Look at Freddie's Pablo Picasso up for auction, folks. Jacqueline Chapeau Noir.
A stage costume locked in a vault or lyrics kept in a safe cannot capture the creative spirit they held when they were in the rooms where he lived. This division means that future generations will never see his personal environment as one single unit, and Kashmira believes this creates a massive cultural gap for the music world. While the physical symbols of his fame moved into private hands, the Bulsara family remains the final guardians of Freddie's earliest and most important years. This part of his life was never up for sale at Sotheby's, yet it is the only period that explains how a boy from Zanzibar became a global force. Kashmira still holds the memories of their childhood and the journey their family took across several continents, along with the cultural roots that Freddie kept until the very end. These opening chapters of his life are not about platinum records or expensive pianos, but instead show the quiet strength of a family starting over in a new country. By keeping these personal stories safe, she ensures her brother's legacy is a human tale of ambition and pride, rather than just a list of high-priced artifacts. She takes this responsibility very seriously because it is her way of honoring how her parents cared for their son's happiness over many decades. The most important lesson from this public struggle is that reclaiming a legacy does not mean someone has to buy back a piano or an old stage outfit. It requires the much harder task of consistently telling the true story of the human being who lived behind the famous myth.
A bit of both, really, but mostly I remember is that he was very generous and kind, and he always used to spoil me, so that was nice.
Kashmira has come to realize that while she cannot choose where his physical things end up, she has full control over how history remembers his character. Her choice to speak out at 73 was a deliberate move to make sure the family's disapproval was recorded as a permanent part of his life story. She wanted everyone to understand that while legal heirs might manage the estate, the actual heart and heritage of the man belonged to his family. This effort to reclaim his identity is her final gift to him, making sure he is remembered as a beloved brother and a son of a proud Parsi family. As the excitement from the Sotheby's auction fades away, the world is left with a version of Freddie Mercury that feels increasingly divided and commercial. The objects that used to sit in his home are now treated as centerpieces for collectors, or as investments for people who never knew him. However, the voice of his sister remains a steady force that pulls the entire narrative back to a grounded reality. Her honest words and her clear distress provided a necessary balance to the polished marketing used by the auction house. She reminded the public that every single auction lot represented a real human life, and every high bid felt like a personal blow to the family who loved him. Freddie Mercury's physical world might be spread across the globe now, but his human story stays whole because Kashmira Bulsara refused to let it be sold with the furniture.
And we as a family were very proud of being Zoroastrian. My religion is a very, very ancient Persian.
It's part of me, and no one's going to stop me, honey.
A deep cultural layer exists in Kashmira's stance that reflects the long Zoroastrian traditions of the Bulsara family. Their faith holds a deep respect for the memory of ancestors and the preservation of personal history. Taking a man's home and selling the contents to the highest bidder feels fundamentally at odds with the dignity Freddie valued. By speaking out against the auction, Kashmira was also speaking for her parents, Jer and Bomi. They worked hard to give Freddie the life that eventually led to his stardom. She feels that her parents would have shared her heartbreak at seeing their son's belongings turned into a public spectacle. This cultural perspective adds moral weight to her disapproval, framing her actions as a defense of her family's sacred values. Mary Austin's role in this story was one that Freddie himself created when he drafted his final will.
He did say that he has got an incurable blood disease. And I just said to him, "It's not AIDS, is it?" And he completely denied it. But I knew that it was AIDS.
He trusted her to manage his home and his most personal things, and she did so for over 30 years. Her decision to sell was her way of closing a chapter that had lasted a lifetime. She believed she was doing what was best for her own future and for the charities Freddie supported. However, the conflict with Kashmira highlights that a legal right does not always equate to an emotional consensus within a family. Both women represent two different ways of loving Freddie Mercury. One focuses on the practical management of his estate, while the other prioritizes the preservation of his human heritage. This divide is the central tragedy of his legacy, showing that even 30 years later, the people who loved him most can still disagree. Reactions from the global fan community also played a significant role in this narrative of memory. Thousands of fans visited the Sotheby's exhibition before the bidding began, and many traveled from other countries to see his world. They left flowers and notes at the gates of Garden Lodge and the auction house, just as they supported Freddie during his final days. Kashmira noticed this outpouring of love and felt it validated her wish for a permanent museum. She saw that the public shared her desire to keep these items together as a collective memorial. The result was a shared connection between the family and the fans that stood in contrast to the auction process. It reminded everyone that while Freddie Mercury belonged to the world, his essence was anchored by those who knew him as a man.
It was so sad. I felt that it was a waste of a lovely, talented life.
That Sotheby's auction will be remembered as a massive financial event, but Kashmira Bulsara's words will stay as the emotional truth of that moment. She has taught the world that a legacy is not made of gold records, but of the stories we tell and the people we remember. Her voice has ensured that Freddie Mercury's human identity remains the most important part of his story. His music and the life he lived are far too big to be contained in any auction catalog. Freddie Mercury may be a star of the past, but through the courage of his sister, he remains a living presence. While the objects may be gone, the love that preserved them for 30 years ensures that his soul is never truly for sale. Kashmira has made it clear that the true reclamation of a brother's life happens in the quiet protection of his story. Every time she speaks about his roots and his human heart, she wins the battle for his legacy. Collectors can buy his piano, but they can never buy the memories of the sister who stood by him through it all. This is how his story remains intact, guarded by the one person who knew him long before the world knew his name.